Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our panel on Indigenous data sovereignty from concept to action. My name is Marty Cook. I'm Assistant Vice President at the University of Waterloo, and I'll be moderating this session. Let's get to it. As you know, Canada has made commitments to Indigenous data sovereignty, particularly in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. And in fact, we heard Mr. Burt speak to this in his very first address of the day this morning. But of course, this is a challenging task to achieve Indigenous data sovereignty, and it involves navigating a number of complex issues, including the complexity of data and the diversity of Indigenous peoples and issues across the country. Fortunately, we have three panelists here today who are in many ways at the center of the Indigenous data sovereignty conversation in Canada. You have their extended bios in your program, so I'll just briefly introduce them now. So first, Chris Penny is the Director of the Centre for Indigenous Statistics and Partnerships and the Champion for Indigenous Employees at Statistics Canada. Eric Guimont is the Chief Data Officer and Director General of the Strategic Research and Data Innovation Branch of Indigenous Services Canada. And Jonathan Dewar is Chief Executive Officer of the First Nations Information Government Centre. So I'm sure that many of you have questions, so as you're formulating them, I'll start off with a general question for each of our panelists. And so I'll just ask all of you to give your perspective. From where you sit, what is Indigenous data sovereignty and why is it so important both for Indigenous peoples and for government? And I think I'll ask Eric to start with that.
Thank you, Marty. I'll answer with actually a personal story. Myself, I'm not First Nation, Inuit, or Métis, but I am married to a First Nation woman who had children prior to our relationship with a non-Indigenous man. And for those who are not aware, there is an Indian Act in Canada that states, a very colonial act, that defines who's First Nation. And also defines how that legal status is transferred to the next generation. So my wife was, I'll say, full status. So she had children with a non-Indigenous man. So her children had limited ability to transfer that status to their children. And she has a daughter, my wife, consider my daughter too now. She had a son, my wife's grandson, my grandson. According to that act, he's not First Nation. Therefore, he doesn't appear anywhere in the Indian Register, a database that maintains, that collects information, basic demographic information about First Nations in Canada. Therefore, her grandson, my grandson, is not part of the narrative, official narrative, because he's not First Nation. I once asked a person who was sort of having a good conversation with me about it and sort of standing sort of on the opposite side of the conversation. I said, well, feel free to challenge grandma about the fact that grandson is not First Nation. So I'll just leave you with that thought. So to me, that's why it became important. It became real because of real personal experiences. I'll leave the more technocratic, bureaucratic answers for the next questions.
Okay. Thank you. Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that story, Eric. So I'm here representing a national First Nations organization. We're strictly technical and strictly apolitical, so I'm not here representing First Nations collectively, directly, or any one First Nation directly. But we do work, and have been doing work for some 26, almost 27 years now, for the last 15 years as this national standalone organization. We have been doing work that is the assertion of First Nations data sovereignty via some specific pieces of work. National surveillance work, research on priorities that have come out of that 26 years of surveillance work, research that is beyond that scope to essentially everything under the sun that is First Nations data sovereignty. And now, significantly for the last few years, we've been advancing a national First Nations data governance strategy in partnership with the Government of Canada, and we work in partnership with Canadian institutions like Statistics Canada. Now, that being said, I'm representing First Nations interests in the work we've been directed to do as a First Nations organization. We also have to acknowledge and make space for our Inuit and Métis Nation colleagues who aren't on this panel. And although we share many similarities, realistically, I think we could probably, take that term Indigenous data sovereignty and take it apart a little bit and acknowledge that we really are talking about sovereignties or acknowledging the fact that in the contemporary lexicon, this idea of Indigenous data sovereignty has really landed with some force because of the work internationally. There was reference to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, now Canadian law, the UNDRIP Act. So Indigenous data sovereignty is a very important term, but once you're in the Canadian context, I'd certainly advise you to dispense with this sort of blanket term and acknowledge that we're talking about First Nations, plural, and the distinct worldviews that First Nations have. Yes, First Nations choose to come together collectively in a variety of ways. That's true for Inuit, that's true for the Métis Nation as well. But ultimately what we're talking about when we say First Nations data sovereignty is First Nations asserting sovereignty. We have a current federal government that uses the language of nation to nation, but I think it's a live question as to whether or not we've solved or resolved questions of First Nations sovereignty. And then data sovereignty is an expression of First Nations sovereignty. And so that's when First Nations people come together as a collective, whether at the community level, the nation level, or collectives of nations across the country, then we are in a situation where it is that First Nations collective, the nation, that has collective rights over all information that identifies the nation. And as I said, you can of course ladder that up to the collective at a national level. We are a national organization that does work that is best done or necessarily done at a national level. But that's ultimately what it means is it's part of the broader assertion of First Nations sovereignty, but it's sovereignty over all information on the part of the collective rights of the nation or nations.
Okay. Thanks so much for giving that context. Chris, from your perspective at StatsCan.
Yeah, thank you for that. Actually, first I wanted to acknowledge Eric's story and say it's actually very reflective of my own personal story. I'm not First Nations, I'm a beneficiary of the Nunatsiavut government out in Labrador, and it made me think of my children who are not beneficiaries of the Nunatsiavut land claim. So yeah, there's a complex history there, and it has implications and effects on people across this country. So I think that was a very important point to make. To get to the perspective of data sovereignty, I think that I can't define what data sovereignty is, only to say that it is acknowledged and it's understood that Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination, up to and including self-government, and of course, control over data is a part of that. We know, or those who are working in this context know, that there's a very complex environment of self-determination, jurisdictions, treaty rights, other constitutional rights, and so the data is part of that conversation. It doesn't make it any easier, but it's clearly stated and it's understood that talking about data is just as important as talking about any of these other aspects of self-determination.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'll say, members of the audience, if you have any question at all, just raise your hand and wave it violently if you need to so I can see it. And yeah, we'll get a mic over to you. And okay, great. As she's walking over to find you, I'll just ask another question of Chris. And I'll say, what are the most important, so we've heard a lot of sessions today about general data-related issues. So we've heard issues about management, how they're gathered, how data are shared, sometimes properly, sometimes improperly. Specifically with regard to government data and Indigenous peoples' rights, what are the most important things? What are some of the specific considerations that you think are important?
I think from my perspective and the perspective of Statistics Canada is that one of the biggest considerations is the jurisdictional complexity to which I was referring just a moment ago. You know, we have 10 provinces, 3 territories. We have municipal governments. We have services and policies that affect First Nations, Métis, and Inuit differently from coast to coast to coast. These activities create data and generate data, plus there's the work of Statistics Canada, of course, but then the provincial, territorial statistical agencies and groups. So there's so much data, there are so many people that are involved in this conversation that I think understanding all of those relationships can be extremely difficult, but it's obviously crucial when you're speaking with First Nations, Métis, or Inuit partners, because it's intrinsic that Indigenous peoples be front and center in that conversation, but also there are other different players in those conversations depending on the situation.
Thanks. Jonathan, I know your organization has been in many ways a leader in answering this very question, but I'll nonetheless throw it to you. What are some of the specific considerations with regard to data and Indigenous people?
Yeah, I mean, it's so incredibly complex. The history of our organization is we've had quite a narrow lane to operate within, and I think that that's been very appropriate. We led the development of a national First Nations health survey. Now have a second national survey. We'll soon be onboarding a third national survey on a very important topic, child and family service, or excuse me, child well-being. So that work is really essential. We did that work in the spirit of data sovereignty for some 30 years, 3 decades, without some of the progress I think we've seen more concretely in the last, say, decade and a half, and certainly in the last couple of years, where we're actually building towards frameworks to ensure that First Nations can assert data sovereignty in the work that we do. So I mentioned the National Data Governance Strategy. That's a 2020 strategy document funded in federal budget 2021 to begin phase 1 implementation of that strategy, which is essentially putting resources into each of our 10 regions, which doesn't map perfectly to the provinces and territories in Canada, but covers all of that land and water, except for Nunavut, which is not First Nations territory. Our phase 1 is all about putting resources into each of the 10 regions, which is our network, the context within which we work, to ensure that there is the human capacity, the financial capacity, and the technical capacity to carry necessary conversations around how First Nations can do data sovereignty in each of those regions, how they can have their own institution. We've long called that a regional information governance center, but you can also think of it as a shared statistical services institution. And then all of those institutions will exist as a network that is doing work that is best done or necessarily done at a national level. So we've had this sort of steady growth towards these ideas that First Nations have championed for many years, not always the same level of support from our federal, provincial, territorial partners, but we've made significant progress with many barriers still to come. And just to talk really, really briefly about some of the complexities, I earlier said, talking about the collective right of First Nations for any information that identifies them. Well, it's actually much more complex than that, and I should have my hand slapped for speaking so simplistically about it. We're also talking about information about the lands and waters. And so I would extend this idea of any information that identifies a First Nation, it is the collective right of the nation to own, control, access, and or possess that information. Any lands, any waters that are First Nations traditional lands and waters necessarily identify, if you don't have blinders on, necessarily identify a First Nation or those First Nations. So it's the collective right to own, control, access, and or possess all information that implicates First Nations. So incredibly complex, incredibly far-reaching.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. Both you and Chris speak to the complexity of this. Eric, your position, you sit kind of nested in the middle of all this complexity. Do you have anything to add about specific considerations with regard to data and Indigenous peoples?
I guess I'm going to highlight another complexity. The one that relates to the family I'm part of, federal family. So Jonathan mentioned this work about, I'll use shorthand, institution creation. Well, that institution won't operate in a vacuum. once it's stood up and operates. It will want to have relationship with Statistics Canada, with Indigenous Services Canada, with other provinces. So where I sit at Indigenous Services Canada, it's important to start changing that culture of the organization that for the longest time was about accumulating data, owning, controlling, possessing the data, to one where we go, no, it has to go the other way. Now, the enabling legislation of Indigenous Services Canada actually states that we're supposed to work towards service transfer, meaning all programs and services will be, and I'm using words loosely here, devolved, transferred to First Nations, Inuit and Métis. Obviously, there's going to be a large data component associated with that. So hence that movement of out with the data. So we need to do a lot of work within our department, but also other departments who also have a lot of data, right? And the way we're focusing on that right now is through the establishment of data sharing protocols, data sharing guides, educating our own folks, establishing proper governance structures in the department, working on a governance structure with FNIGC, exploring different ways of governing the data. I was listening to previous presenters, previous sessions, and loosely listening, and I thought, it seems often we're talking about governance, but we're actually talking about communications. We will communicate what we're doing. I'm talking about something else. I'm talking about sitting at the table with Jonathan and say, okay, how we're going to manage that data. Jonathan, what do you see in the data that's good, not good? How will we communicate? How will we use? How will we share together? Governing together up to the moment where we're no longer in the picture as a department because services has been transferred as well as the data, and then Jonathan or other organizations that deliver services, they'll need the data too, take on that data. So it's working on preparing, changing that mindset. 150 years of accumulating data that needs to be turned around.
So really different, we're talking different paradigms is really where we're going. Yeah. Sir, thank you for your patience. Can you please start with your name and where you're coming from?
The mic's not on.
Is it?
How about now?
There you go.
Brilliant. Okay. Hello, my name's Jonathan Dench. I come from OSFI, under the financial portfolio. Thank you all very much for being willing to share with us about data sovereignty issues. And I want to continue on this theme of complexity because I hear encouraging things about this development of a framework, institutionalizing the ways that data will be collected and this transfer to empowerment, that ownership. Beautiful. But data interoperability is necessary for that data to become useful. How do we make sure that every one of these institutions doesn't have to individually organize or orchestrate or manage the agreement of data sharing with every single government department? How do we ensure Government of Canada has a functional one-size-fits-all managed by which that data mapping ensures there's a general interoperability so that when my department goes to look at these sovereign data, I'm seeing it and it is as easy for me to see it as the other departments that necessarily need that data. And so there's not a reporter burden where it's their problem to tell us, right? How do we make sure that it's made easy and appropriate so that that sovereignty is just another burden and barrier for them?
Wow, thank you, John. So what I'm hearing is, on the one hand, you have a real need for data, as you say, interoperability and standards and consistency, and to make it understandable to everybody across very complex, multiple data sources, multiple government departments and agencies. On the other hand, also, as Jonathan points out, you have a wide breadth of First Nations, Métis, Inuit organizations across the country with different interests, capacities, and so on. And so how do we have a framework that facilitates true data sovereignty within that, in that context? Chris, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start a little bit from my perspective at Statistics Canada. I know that standards is something that we do at Statistics Canada. I think I've heard it said, and I would agree, there are basically two things that Statistics Canada produces. One is data or statistics, and the other is standards. And we do produce a number of standards that are used nationally. Now, of course, that's within Statistics Canada. That's not a paradigm to say we produce it and now everyone can just use what we provide. We do have conversations across the country. I was just actually having a conversation with colleagues in a provincial government who are looking at standards to do their internal work. And so they obviously want to align as much as possible standards, but they're not there simply to receive what Statistics Canada does. So it's another example of that need to create those standards together. Maybe not everyone uses the same standards. That obviously means that there's no comparability in those areas, but maybe those data are actually answering different things, and maybe that's not actually a bad thing in all cases. So it is something we've also discussed with Indigenous partners, that need for standards and shared discussion, and I think along with just the data, yeah, having those conversations is something that we have begun to do, and it is very important.
So a known issue for
yes,
sure.
absolutely.
Yeah. Eric, oh, sorry.
Can I go first?
Yeah, John.
So first, apologies that I can't see you because these lights are so bright. You're just sort of blobs out there, but I know the question came from over here. So our data governance strategy, the 2020 document, which is available on our website, has interoperability as one of the core principles of the work, right? Now, the whole idea of the data governance strategy was to say that First Nations have reached a point where we will purpose build. And so one of the messages that I often deliver, and for example, I spent a couple of years on the Pan-Canadian Health Data Strategy Expert Advisory Group, where my message often repeated to that group was, listen, Canada, and by that I mean all of its constituent elements, Canada built a broken system, or rather a broken system of systems, and Canada has a responsibility to fix it for all Canadians, and that includes Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Inuit, and citizens of the Métis Nation. But that is a message that continually has to be delivered, that Canada, get your damn house in order and fix the things that you purpose-built wrong or have broken over many, many years. That includes promises, false starts, pilots that never went anywhere. So that's a key message. It's much more pointed than I usually say because we try to stay quite apolitical. But I'm saying that strictly from the technical perspective. Canada has to do that work on its side of the equation. On our side of the equation, and hopefully I can say this for what I know of Inuit and Métis efforts as well, is we are purpose building towards institutions that will be built in, so I use the example of, in each of our 10 regions, there will be an information governance regime built by the First Nations. There will be this institution built by the First Nations. So built in their image, governed by them. But we've all come together already to agree to those principles, where interoperability has to be part of those principles. So we will not be building without interoperability. Yes, regional institutions will be able to work regionally, sub-regionally, at nation and community levels, outside of that national or collective, collaborative context. Absolutely. But we cannot build 10 regional institutions without the ability for them to come together on all of those principles we've established, and interoperability is a key one. Now, does that mean we have the capacity to build interoperability with all facets of the federal, provincial, territorial network of partnerships? No. That's the Canada Get Your House in Order. You've supported this. Our expectation is you're doing your work on your end.
Thank you for the straight talk. I'm sure this audience appreciates it. Eric, anything to add?
I agree with Jonathan. I mean, I was just referencing the fact that we need to get our house in order. So obviously, we share views on this. Excellent question. Again, I can't really see, like Jonathan, it's really bright here. We often come at Indigenous data, or even Indigenous data sovereignty, from a very technical aspect. I absolutely agree that interoperability is very important. In previous jobs I held, that was challenging, if not problematic at times. But we first need to start with governance. Jonathan referenced the work they're doing in terms of governance on their side. We also need to do that internally. I work closely with our CIO within the department to have improved governance structures within our department. And then after that, there's the relationship with these institutions, these centers that are going to be created. That aspect also of governance that needs to be focused on. Once that is well established, then I think we can tackle more of the technical nature. There's too often I'm invited to meetings to talk about Indigenous data sovereignty, and they're coming at things from a purely technical point of view, and then it's a bunch of data geeks talking about data, but we're not talking about people who talk about law. We're not talking to politicians. We're not talking to people who deliver services and programs. So it's a much broader conversation, and that's why I keep referring to there's a need for a paradigm shift where stop working towards accumulating. We need to push out, and we need to get ourselves, our business in order so we're able to do that in an efficient way, not reproduce mistakes of the past. We want service transfer to be efficient. We want good data to be transferred. You can't manage what you can't measure, like I like to say, right? And ultimately, we want the well-being in First Nation communities, Inuit communities, Métis communities to improve and achieve substantive equality. Data is an important piece of that, and governance, it starts with proper governance, not a conversation amongst technicians that often is done in parallel inside meetings or at the end of any discussions, whether it's self-government or service transfer.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. Ma'am, you have a question.
Is it on? Okay. Hi, I'm Heidi from Canada School of Public Service, the GC Data Community Team. And my question was actually, Eric started talking on the technologist aspect, and I was wondering, I heard the reference to things related to land, and so I guess my question is around the nuance between data, information, and knowledge, and how sort of we tend to talk about data in terms of like the structured stuff that you can fit into a data set, and I think there's nothing governments are better at doing than producing yet another framework to be applied. So like, I guess I'm just curious to hear your thoughts in terms of like that fundamental definition of like what is included in Indigenous data sovereignty. Like, there are things like archives, there are physical materials that are stored in museums. I think we tend not to view, because of the conversations being so centered around the technology aspect, that we don't view some of those things as part of that data sovereignty conversation. So anyway, I don't know if there's a clear question in there, but
Yeah, no, thank you. So what I'm hearing is, what is data? What counts as data? When we're talking about Indigenous data sovereignty, what is subsumed under that? And so Jonathan mentioned information about lands and waters and airways, I suppose. But what is it? And your archives suggestion, I think, is really a great one. I don't know, I hate to keep starting with Chris, but is that something you've thought about?
Absolutely. As somebody who works at Statistics Canada, yes, it absolutely is something that I think about. And clearly my job and the mandate of my organization is data that are used for statistics. It's not any other kind of data. There is geomatic data and other things like that, but it's about statistics. There are many other things that can and should be considered data. Without being able to actually quote chapter and verse, there is a principle in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that talks specifically about the intellectual property of stories, language, medicines, information, traditionally passed down information, and this is data as well, and it can take many forms, and so that is very important. The other aspect I would say too is, to look at another kind of data, and as Eric is talking about, the data that's generated through programs and services that are produced, those are produced for the purpose of administering a program to make that program better for an operational need. Think of, say, medical records at an individual level. That's not something, like, we receive record level data, but as Statistics Canada, we work with it in terms of statistics on aggregates. Those are using those kind of data in other forms is another aspect that we at Statistics Canada don't do. So yeah, there's absolutely a lot.
Great, thank you. Very interesting. Eric, I know you've been involved with archival research, certainly in relation to the TRC. What are your thoughts about the boundary around data?
Well, I think you just said it, Marty. Yes, it includes archives. I mean, you would have asked me that question 40 years ago when I started as a demographer. I would have had a very narrow perspective. But having had the opportunity to work on the implementation of the residential school settlement agreement, especially as it relates to document disclosure, work still going on, I learned quite a bit in the importance of information, of archives. Also, the grandma was referring to earlier, boy, her ears are going to be buzzing. I'm talking a lot about her. She works at Library and Archives. She leads a group that is focusing on the transfer, the access to archives by Indigenous communities, organizations, for example, for purpose of language and culture, looking at the original treaty, signatures. It has a lot of meaning for many communities. So yes, it's much broader than just a pure Excel spreadsheet, definitely.
Right. Jonathan, I know your organization primarily collects health and social kind of data, but I'm sure you've thought about this question as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to acknowledge that the folks who started this work 3 decades ago very deliberately talked about information and information governance. So when we talk about information, we mean everything from traditional knowledge through the ephemeral songs and dances to material culture, and then of course also to data, whether that's administrative data, whether it's quantitative, qualitative data. It's all information. So our focus needs to be, again, we use the terminology of data sovereignty, but we really mean information sovereignty. And I'm happy to have a distinction, to have a definition or more than one definition on when we transition from broader sense of information into data-specific conversations. But I think that is a really, really important distinction because it is archives. You know, it is the material culture and the more ephemeral elements of culture that are held in Canadian institutions like the National Gallery or the Canadian Museum of History. First Nations, and I would say Inuit and the Métis Nation as well, are looking to ensure that they are able to own, control, access, and possess. That's First Nations terminology, but the principles I think hold across Inuit and Métis Nation aspirations as well. We are looking to assert those First Nations principles of OCAP over all information that is First Nations information.
Excellent. Thank you. So, and again, this is all within an umbrella of sovereignty, as you say. Yes. Madam, yes.
I don't know if it works. It works. My name is Ioana Pirneci, and I work for ISC. I have a very simple question. The answer might not be simple. Who's going to pay for this? Thank you.
I beg your pardon, I'm sorry?
Who's going to pay for this?
Who's going to pay for this?
Because we are talking about records that they will need to be scanned, they will need to be sent, we might keep copies, we might send stuff to LAC. Budgets are really tight. Thank you.
Okay. It feels like an Eric question maybe to start.
I mean, every initiative I've been part of, yes, there's been an element of funding. I think every situation, every circumstance will be different. I've also been involved in initiatives where we did not necessarily have to provide any funding. We provided data. During COVID, we were approached by province of Manitoba and FINISM, the right First Nation organization in Manitoba, to share the Indian Register with the province with the support, the participation of FINISM, that First Nation organization, so that proper COVID tracking could be done in the province of Manitoba when it relates to First Nations and First Nation communities. So we provided data. And that was quite the achievement, I would say, in terms of data sharing that was put together quite swiftly and included a First Nation organization. It wasn't between two levels of governments absent the participation of First Nations. So yes, sometimes there's resources required. I've been part of some of these initiatives, like the one you referred to earlier, Marty, with the TRC, that was large. But there's also instances where it's about data or just sharing knowledge. Been part of discussions related to the importance of remoteness when it comes to communities. And my group have done a fair bit of work in that area. And we've shared that knowledge with First Nation organizations. So it wasn't just about Canada developing its own tools and keeping it to itself. No, it was about sharing that. I always come from a place where if we have a common understanding about issues, about circumstances, we're likely to have eventually a common understanding about solutions, less of an antagonistic approach. So multiple ways to react to a situation. Sometimes, yes, money is involved.
Yeah,
Chris, as your,
I was just going to jump in there.
Okay.
I mean, we hear this question all the time, and it's often, a genuine question coming from a place of, people really wanting to seek answers. It's not always, that question is not always posed that way. I mean, I would say this, the most positive way for me to talk about it is this idea that, Canada is a world-leading democracy, and whether you call it the social contract or whatever, Canada has and continues to build institutions for the good of Canadians, right? It builds for the common good. These are investments, not costs. These are investments, right? And it is for the common good. Now, I've made a point, quite a pointed point, about Canada having built broken systems and needing to fix those systems. So, yeah, it is the expectation that Canada will invest in building better for the future, where it is a communal future, it is a collective future for all of us. And First Nations certainly understand that what we're asking for is to be able to assert the sovereignty, to do self-government, self-determination under that broad umbrella of sovereignty, to do data sovereignty through our own First Nations-led institutions, but very much in this larger ecosystem or environment of Canadian institutions across the country. So in a sense, reframe the question on Canada's ongoing investments in the social contract. And I think that is a really positive way to think about it.
Thank you. And Chris, from your perspective at StatsCan, I know, I'm sure you have a lot of experience with dealing with the question of, okay, if we're going to do this, where does the money come from?
Absolutely. Statistics Canada does receive federal money as part of the federal public service. We also do a lot based on partnerships where other partners come to us with funding to produce data. But I would have to say, in sum, I agree with Jonathan. There is a social contract that the institutions of Canada are required to serve everyone in this country. And the fact is, as Jonathan says, the way that institutions have been built, certainly over many years, have been targeting some people and not others as much. I think that's a fair statement to make. We are working to rebuild, renew, make new structures. And it does cost money, and we know that there's always more. There are more things to do than there is money, and so we obviously have to prioritize things. But the other thing I'd like to say, just to put that question aside, it doesn't cost anything to have a conversation in good faith and with a good heart, and to talk to people and to see how things are working, because there's a lot we can do that doesn't require a new database. It doesn't require a staff of half dozen or a dozen people to be working on it. We can have conversations and start that dialogue, build those relationships, and those don't always need to cost money.
Thank you. Madam.
Is it on? Yep. My name's Kelsey. I'm from the Canada Border Services Agency, and I'm going to read my question if that's okay. On the theme of practical questions, I'm wondering, how do we act thoughtfully and proactively to find the balance between data sovereignty, data collection required for program participation and data sovereignty? So can we have data sovereignty with mandated collection, and what should we be considering in that space, if so?
So, sorry, just so I understand, this is in the context of data collection for program use.
That's right.
And so what are the considerations if you're collecting data
Right.
that will, in order to facilitate data sovereignty, what do you have to include in that? What should you even be, for example, what do you need to be also including in those data?
Yeah, what do you need to include with it, and what should we be considering if we're going to be pushing the data back out for it to be useful to somebody? We're collecting it for our own purposes for the program, but what else should we be considering here?
Maybe because you might not know the full extent of who might, for example, have a claim on those data at the moment. Yeah. Anybody want to take a shot? Jonathan?
I'll take a quick stab at it. So it's certainly not our expectation that public servants are caught in sort of the gears of these big, heady conversations around sovereignty and data sovereignty. That's really Canada's responsibility and its nation-to-nation relationships with First Nations, individual nations, governments, or when nations come together collectively. So I always have a great deal of empathy for public servants, particularly when they've done a lot of work to become knowledgeable about First Nations data sovereignty, the OCAP principles. We have a wonderful online course that many federal and provincial territorial public servants take to learn about the OCAP principles. But we have a great deal of empathy for folks, because then the questions are always, so what do I do? How am I acting in good faith? Well, we don't expect you to break the law. We just expect you to be aware and part of the conversation internally that is appropriate to your role, so that you can help advance the change that needs to happen within federal departments and institutions. I'm using the federal case here because that's our context primarily. And it is up to others in that larger context to advance conversations at those higher levels. So don't feel like you're caught in the gears of these things, but definitely do ask questions, become knowledgeable about these things, advocate for better education on how First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation are approaching questions of nationhood, nation-to-nation relationship, sovereignty, self-determination, self-government, and then help those conversations in your departments. Canada and First Nations will have the appropriate conversations that are more big P or small p political, and we'll all be better for it in the long run. And so hopefully that gives some solace to people who are wondering, in this age of truth and reconciliation, how can I be a good person, a good public servant, working on a file that I know has a legacy of mistrust or distrust? It's be that good person, and we are moving in the right direction, ultimately.
Thank you. Chris, any thoughts from StatsCan perspective?
Well, I think it's from the StatCan perspective, it's a little challenging. We don't directly collect program data. We are a secondary user of those data. When we collect information, obviously through the Statistics Act, there is a requirement to ensure that we are doing this in the public good. There are processes in place, and everything is accountable ultimately to the chief statistician when we're taking these data. The other aspect to this is we do work very closely with our provincial and territorial counterparts. So if you think of a lot of the data that's held by Statistics Canada, whether it's health data, whether it's crime and justice data, whether it's economic data, a lot of these data come from provincial and territorial governments. we know they have their own relationships and their own regimes with regards to their citizens. They would have different relationships with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit citizens as well. But then we communicate with these partners, and you know, we're trying to make sure that we are all working together, and again, not using these data in ways that are inappropriate. One of the things we are actually working on with the First Nations Information Governance Center, as well as others, is thinking of how can we work together in the future. We secondarily collect program data from different elements. How do we ensure that we are able to appropriately engage with First Nations and Métis and Inuit as well in ways that provide that voice and that role to have those conversations together?
Okay. Eric, program data, I think probably outside of ISK we're talking about, I think.
Okay, because I didn't quite get all the question, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
So, very quickly, when I'm thinking of our department, often the relationship with communities, with organizations, is through funding agreements. These funding agreements carry reporting obligations, and historically, the reporting was imposed, not necessarily meaningful always. A lot of work has been done by many of my colleagues through the new fiscal relationship in terms of looking at reporting requirements, reporting obligation, reducing reporting burden, but at the same time elevating the quality of what's being reported on so it's meaningful to First Nation recipients of the funding, as well as the department, because the department needs to report on that funding. So that's a channel where there's been a lot of conversations in terms of the development of meaningful reporting, meaningful indicators, not something that's imposed from the proverbial center. Yeah.
I think we're at the point where we should be thinking about breaking for lunch. Can I just ask, do any of you have any last thoughts, anything that we haven't covered in terms of Indigenous data sovereignty, where we're going, what needs to be done, and so on? Jonathan, maybe start with you.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we are hopeful that we'll continue to receive support from the federal government for the implementation of the National Data Governance Strategy. We've had this 3-year phase to implement what is phase 1 of our data strategy. We need to move into the second phase. So moving from the blueprints around the carrying of those conversations around information governance in regions and nationally, and the shared statistical services institutions governed by First Nations. We're drawing the blueprints. We now need to move into the next phase, which is to build those up, including the interoperability, including the partnership and relationships with Canadian institutions. Building up Indigenous institutions does not mean tearing down Canadian institutions, but it necessarily means that paradigm shift we referenced earlier. So Canadian institutions have to pivot, have to change in the context of that paradigm shift. So our focus is very practical and pragmatic on the one hand, but we're also a part of the conversation at those highest levels, helping to inform First Nations and First Nations leadership on what it means to dream of that future where First Nations assert sovereignty, including information sovereignty. Barriers abound. Canadian laws, particularly the Canadian laws that are the Canadian information governance regime, don't have space for, work against concepts of collective rights over information. So there are major changes still to do in that big paradigm shift context.
Thank you. Eric?
I'm just gonna, well, you've probably figured out we've known each other for a while, and we actually collaborate on many files. Chris, Jonathan, we've known Marty for a while. But that's just 4 of us. So I'm going to leave you with questions, hopefully that some of those questions will resonate with you and echo with you, and then you'll start acting on data sovereignty, Indigenous data sovereignty, First Nation and Métis. Do we know, we, the collective, the Royal, do we know what data we hold that pertains to Indigenous people? When you're thinking of you or your organizations, who is the best entity to collect and store data needed? Do the data concepts used reflect the understanding and interest of Indigenous people? We always have all these beautiful frameworks of indicators, but often They're very Eurocentric. And last, do the ways we collect, and store data, do we make it accessible and useful to Indigenous people? So I'm leaving you with those questions. Maybe then it's not going to be just the 4 of us. It's going to be 40, 140, because I can't see how many we are in here, but many more.
Nice. Chris, any last words?
You know, just very finally, actually, I think Eric really sort of said it there, is just to turn the conversation to ourselves individually and in terms of the organizations that we work for. I was just going to say, continue the conversation. I think things are always improving, things are always developing. We're always sort of pushing those posts forward, and I think we continue doing that just through openness, through dialogue, through cooperation, and I don't have anything else more to say. I think that sums it up.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for sticking with us and for your questions. Please join me in thanking Chris, Eric, and Jonathan for their personal and also professional insights on this.